An oral history with Caron Balkany, and it's for the Maria Rogers Oral History Project for the Carnegie Library in Boulder. And Caron has written with a co-author a book concerning the grand jury and that investigated Rocky Flats. So we're going to be talking about the book and her role with the grand jury's investigation and the implications for Rocky Flats. And also, we'll probably be talking about the impact that all this has on the wildlife refuge that's planned for the Rocky Flats area. So thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you.
The first thing I wanted to ask you that we always ask everyone is, when and where were you born?
I was born in 1950 in Miami, Florida.
And can you say just a little bit about your background, kind of briefly how you got to where you are now?
Well, I'm an attorney. I've been an attorney for way too long. And I've been a public interest attorney for at least 2 decades now.
And did you, was this something that, did you come from a family where this kind of thing was important, or?
No, being of service to other people was important to my mother, yes, and being of service to other people has been a pleasure for me. So that's why I do it. It's quite selfish. I enjoy it.
And where did you go to school?
I graduated from George Washington University in D.C., went to law school at the University of Miami.
And now I believe that you now live in New Mexico.
I do.
Right? How did you get from there to New Mexico?
The house that I was in Miami got destroyed by a hurricane. And I decided, instead of hanging around feeling dispossessed, I'd go on a journey and go someplace that was as different from Miami as I could think of. And Santa Fe qualifies for that. And then we just fell in love with it, my husband and I, and we stayed.
So you lived there for
since 1993.
And you said that you do public interest legal work.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, women's rights groups is where I started, rape victims, setting up a rape treatment center in Dade County, working with the people that were doing that. And then when I became an attorney representing the victims and working for legislation to protect rape victims. And then I went on to environmental work. When I got to Santa Fe, I was so intrigued with citizens there actually having an impact on something as global as nuclear weapons and a nuclear waste that I started volunteering with a local group there and spent 7 years doing that and litigating against Los Alamos.
Oh, yes. And what group was that?
I was Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety. I was the president of that for 7 years and represented them with some other people in Santa Fe and sued Los Alamos for violations of the regulations on radioactive air emission laws. We won. That was encouraging and it was fun, and it got me a real education in how the government acts with respect to both nuclear safety regulations and nuclear waste.
That must have been a lot of work for you.
Yeah, it was. But as I said, it's a pleasure because I get to do what I want to do. There's no better pleasure, I don't think.
Yeah. And how did you get to meet Wes McKinley and start focusing on the issues around Rocky Flats?
Well, Wes came down to speak to CCNS, Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety, and a colleague of mine at the time introduced us and said, this cowboy needs some legal advice. And I was basically the provider of legal advice when possible. So that's how I met Wes, and he's a delightful, committed person. And as I got to know him, I realized we weren't going to solve his problem through the legal system. We had to do something else. So that's how we started on this process.
I see.
That resulted in the book.
Yes. Now, he was coming down then wanting to get some legal help.
Yes.
From someone who would know something about it.
He really was coming down to speak to this group about what had happened at Rocky Flats and how they'd been shut up and shut down, and trying to warn them and encourage them to keep fighting but he couldn't say very much. And so the legal advice that he wanted was, somebody help me find out some way to tell what went on, because it needs to be told.
And did you, how did the book end up? Maybe you can just kind of hold that book up and I'll make sure that
There it is.
yeah. The Ambush Grand Jury. How the Justice Department covered up government nuclear crimes and how we caught them red-handed.
That's it. And here's the back. And there's Wes, one in the cowboy hat.
Yeah. So how did it, you just started kind of working with him?
Well, I was trying to figure out how to solve his problem, which was being told by the judicial system that he couldn't talk about what happened, but knowing that he had taken an oath to uphold the law and that illegal activities had happened behind the closed doors of the grand jury chambers, which prevented him from upholding his oath. He was in quite a dilemma.
So it's kind of like a double blind.
It was a real double bind, and he'd already tried with the other grand jurors to get immunity from Congress, but there'd been a huge lobbying effort by other defense contractors to stop them from getting immunity. A big surprise, because then I think people would know a whole lot more about what goes on with the Justice Department and how it handles the activities of the Energy Department with respect to nuclear activities and nuclear crimes. And that's something the defense contractors at all the other weapon sites are vulnerable to. So they put up a big lobbying effort, and the grand jurors did not get immunity. So he knew that wasn't going to work, and the other grand jurors filed a lawsuit to try to get the court to lift the rule which stops them from being able to speak. And Wes didn't think that a court was ever going to let the grand jurors speak. So he didn't want to go that way either. So what we decided to do is do a citizens investigation and try to prove what had happened. Try to prove the cover-up by doing a shadow investigation of what the FBI and the Justice Department had done. We sort of shadowed them. We used the Freedom of Information Act. We tried to use the Freedom of Information Act. We did get some documents, but not very many. We used our heads, we used common sense, and we used the goodwill of a lot of people who really wanted the truth to come out. We figured if we could prove just one cover-up by the Justice Department. They made many, many, many public statements about the FBI raid and the grand jury investigation and what they had done. They made many public statements, which frankly were probably Rule 6e violations themselves. They should not have been talking about that, but they did. And they made it sound like they'd done a wonderful job, and that the grand jury agreed with the settlement that they made with Rockwell, the defense contractor, that the grand jury agreed that there wasn't enough evidence to indict any individuals or Department of Energy individuals, and that the grand jury agreed that there wasn't really any offsite harm from Rocky Flats. That's what they made it sound like. And of course you can imagine the grand jurors sitting in the background just seething because they knew that wasn't true, and yet they weren't allowed to say anything. So,
can you explain what the Rule 6e is?
Rule 6e is basically a rule of criminal procedure that says if you're a grand juror, as respects the situation, if you're a grand juror, you don't get to talk about certain things that went on in the grand jury room. The deliberations of the grand jury, their vote, testimony, evidence, but not everything. Doesn't cover everything. So we looked for the not everything that it didn't cover. We used a lot of that. And we also have a very basic philosophical position, which is, if you look at the history of Rule 6e and what it's designed to do, and you look at the Constitution, which provides for a grand jury, but which doesn't provide for grand jury secrecy rules, that's a Justice Department creation, a judicial creation. If you look at that and you look at it together, you have to come to the conclusion that those confidentiality rules were not meant to cover misconduct or obstruction of justice behind the grand jury doors by the Justice Department itself. It cannot be. Not in this country. That cannot be. So there's no law that says that. Wes has taken a risk, but he feels it's important enough that he's willing to do it, and I think he's right, and I'm willing to help him. So that's part of what we did. We took that position that the Justice Department cannot hide behind Rule 6E when they lie to a grand jury. And then we went and proved, what we did was try to prove just one thing that we could show where the Justice Department said one thing and we can prove that it's not true. And we figured if we can prove just one, then we can show Congress, we can show the American people that where there's smoke, maybe there's a little fire, and maybe they ought to look at the rest of what went on with that grand jury report. In the process, we actually proved a lot more criminal conduct than we've put in this book. We couldn't put it all in. But this book focuses on the secret midnight plutonium burning charges that were in the search warrant the FBI served when it first raided Rocky Flats. And we picked that one because it was in the search warrant that Rockwell was secretly burning plutonium when the plutonium incinerator was supposed to be shut down, and that the FBI had caught them doing it with infrared cameras from a Night Stalker plane that they had flown overhead at the time, and that was in the search warrant. Very shortly after the grand jury was convened, there were articles in the paper saying, from Governor Romer and from Congressman Skaggs, saying they'd done an investigation. They were sure there had been no midnight burning. And then ultimately the case was settled by the Justice Department against Rockwell for a fine with no criminal indictments against any individuals, including the Energy Department. And one of the official statements that the Justice Department made on behalf of Rockwell, which was required by Rockwell, we later find out, there had been no midnight plutonium burning. That became the official position of the Justice Department. Well, we figured if we can prove that that's not true, which we had a sneaking suspicion it wasn't, then we'll really be able to show that there was something badly amiss with the Justice Department's handling of the investigation. So we went out and proved that that statement was false, and that in fact there was midnight plutonium burning, and that the Justice Department knew it, and that they intentionally dropped that charge because Rockwell made them, the defense contractor, and that they lied to Congress and to the American people and to the court about that crime. They lied about a whole lot more, but we specifically proved that one in this book.
By proving it by talking with the people who
We
did.
talked to witnesses. We found the guy who did the midnight burn who admitted it. We found that one of the things that the Justice Department said was that they had to drop the charge, even though it was in the search warrant. They had to drop the charge because the infrared analyst who was, who looked at the photos of the plant that night had reversed his position and changed his testimony. Well, I kept fighting Freedom of Information Act requests for his reports, and they get denied. Rule 6E, you can't have them, they're secret grand jury information. Well, I got them anyway. I called the EPA where the shots had been analyzed in Las Vegas, and they just sent them to me. They had their own copies, and they just sent them. And on the front of the report was the analyst's name. So I called him up, and I started telling him what I was doing, and I explained to him that the Justice Department had filed an official report saying that he'd reversed his testimony, and I wanted to talk to him about it. He said, I didn't reverse my testimony. I was a little shocked, but not surprised. I was just shocked, I guess, that he was going to tell me that quite so up front, and he said, I never changed my testimony. That incinerator was burning. So, I've got written documentation from the Justice Department and sworn testimony from the prosecutors that that's why they dropped that midnight plutonium burning charge.
Just to explain a little bit, as I understood from the book, one reason that's so crucial is not because it hadn't been done before or after.
Done all
but
the
it was
time.
Because it was illegal at that particular time.
Yes, thank you. The plutonium incinerator and that whole operation in that building had been shut down for safety violations, so they were not allowed to be burning at that time. But the other reason it was important is because it got a lot of headlines, and excuse me, it made Rockwell and the Department of Energy look bad. It involved lying to the public because they weren't supposed to be doing it. And as a result, Rockwell could have been debarred from getting further government contracts, which would have been a huge fiscal disaster for them. Had Rockwell gone down about this, they would have dragged the Energy Department in there with them. They weren't going to go quietly. And the Energy Department's complicity in a lot of these crimes would have been very, very public. So I believe that was the motivation of the Justice Department in telling the prosecutors to settle this case, settle it quickly, and get out of there.
Now, one of the things that I've been very curious about is why did the FBI raid in the first place? And you do talk about that in the book, but I wonder if you could just kind of reconstruct a little bit what your thoughts are.
Well, I've got several thoughts about it. I think the FBI is not a monolith. There's a lot of different people involved. Same thing with the Justice Department. I think the local FBI people, John Lipsky, wanted to raid Rocky Flats because he wanted to enforce the law against them, just like he does against ordinary people. That's what he told me when he joined this citizens investigation. That's been his position. I think the prosecutors, Ken Finberg, when he initially started this, I think he wanted to bust them because they were contaminating the area. I think he had good motivations. Not so sure about Mike Norton. I'm not so sure.
Both of those two FBI workers lived in Denver. Is that right?
Well, Ken Finberg was a U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney. Yes, he did live in Denver. And at that time, so did John Lipsky.
So they might have been personally concerned.
I think they were personally concerned, but on the other hand, U.S. Attorney Mike Norton lived in Denver too. And his motivations may have been good at the time. I'm told from people who were on the scene that it was very political for him. He thought he could get a lot of press. I don't really like to speculate about what people's motivations were. I like to look at their actions. In the beginning, John Lipsky did a heck of an investigation, and so did Ken Finberg. And then all of a sudden, all this evidence that they'd been working on gets dropped, and you end up with a settlement agreement with Rockwell that makes them pay a fine that's less than their profits, and that results in no possibility that they could get additional liability for off-site contamination, which is a big concern of Rockwell's, and where they don't have to worry about being debarred. Those being main, and that there'd be no grand jury report. Main concerns of Rockwell. Rockwell got basically everything it wanted out of the negotiations. The U.S. government got this fine, but then took over all the responsibility for cleaning up Rocky Flats, which cost 10 or 20 times what the fine was, and Rockwell got off the hook for that too. So I think people started out, some people started out with very good intentions, and they got instructions from people above them to close down the operations. I think a political motivation for those instructions from the higher-ups back in Washington was to protect the administration at the time, the Bush administration at the time, from looking bad, from just looking bad. They said they were going to clean up the nuclear weapons complex, and here's this, huge cover-up instead. So you can't really clean something up by covering it up.
Now, Mike Norton's role in that, what was his role following Lipsky and
Ken Finberg?
Finberg?
Mike Norton was the U.S. Attorney for Colorado at the time. Ken Finberg was his assistant. So Ken was the lead prosecutor for the case, but Mike Norton made the decisions. And Mike Norton is the one who agreed with the Justice Department to close down the investigation, to artificially terminate it, and to get involved in the public deception and congressional deception that followed, making people think that it had been a full investigation, that they'd checked out everything and charged the most serious crimes they could find. That's nonsense. They charged petty crimes, and they didn't even fully investigate all of the evidence that they had of more major ones. I've got memos from them where they're talking about having evidence of data falsification and deceptive monitoring practices, which is what the lab uses, or what Rocky Flats uses to determine how much contamination it's creating, whether or not it was contaminating the drinking water reservoirs off-site. I've got evidence that they had too that shows that that data was falsified. The Justice Department did not pursue that charge. That is not a real investigation, and yet that's not what they told the public or Congress.
I remember when I first learned that in that investigation they didn't do anything with respect to radioactivity.
Well, that's not they did not true? They didn't do anything with respect to pure radioactivity. But if the radioactivity was involved with hazardous waste, in other words, mixed waste, then they did investigate it, but they didn't do full investigations on that either. The other thing that they did, which I find just absurd, there'd been a long-standing regulatory dispute between DOE and EPA about whether RCRA applied to some of the activities at Rocky Flats, and the DOE kept saying no, it doesn't, and the EPA, who's in charge of enforcing RCRA, kept saying yes, it is. Well, ultimately the DOE finally said, oh, okay, it does. Now,
can you explain just parenthetically what
it's just take it as an environmental law that covers waste and hazardous waste, okay? And DOE was saying, no, we're exempt. And EPA was saying, no, you're not. So ultimately the DOE finally gets beaten down and agrees, oh, okay, we're not exempt. Now, can you please tell me why for the 5 to 7 years that regulatory debate that went on, where the DOE was just plain wrong, why they should get away with what they did while they were wrong? These prosecutors said, well, we didn't charge any of these officials because they were engaged in a good faith argument with the EPA about whether or not there was jurisdiction. Well, how'd you like to get involved in a good faith argument with a police officer about whether or not you really were speeding? If it turns out that you really were, guess what? You get the fine. And the fact that you were involved in an argument with them and you were wrong doesn't mean that you don't get prosecuted. It was such a chicken way out of the whole thing, and it provided, it was a legal kind of twist that to me is just the kind of game playing that makes people not respect the legal profession. Yeah, you know, it let Rocky Flats off the hook for an awful lot of criminal behavior. I mean, they'd been burning hazardous waste for since the 1950s in that plutonium incinerator, old and decrepit and no permit.
Of course, people in general don't really understand that.
No, and because of what the Justice Department did with their very deceptive behavior around this FBI investigation, most people still don't know. And that's a lot of why we wrote the book, because I think people deserve to know that before they go letting their kids or grandkids play at Rocky Flats.
What was the process like for you you did most of the research for the book, right?
Mm-hmm. I did a lot of research. A lot of research. But Wes was there the whole time too, and I think we did a lot of research.
And had you written beforehand anything like this?
No, the only thing I've written before this is legal stuff and poetry when I was in high school. That's it. And I will never write anything again either.
Was it a difficult process?
Yes, it was difficult. It was very difficult. We wanted to make it not a heavy read for people, and yet it's a heavy subject. But I really feel like we can't expect people to live the very difficult lives that we live and then ask them to inform themselves about these difficult issues without making an effort to make it at least enjoyable reading. And that's hard because I'm not a writer. So, but we struggled to try to make it at least enjoyable, just out of respect for how hard everybody's lives is and how much other things we have to inform ourselves about. So we've got a modicum of success with making it somewhat interesting.
I found it very interesting.
Thank you.
I couldn't put it down.
That's great.
Now, did you have trouble getting a publisher?
Yes. Massive, massive trouble getting a publisher. There is no freedom of the press in the United States anymore. Unless, you can't cranking it out on your copy machine and handing it out yourself. You can't get publishing house to carry stuff. Very difficult.
This is published by...
This is published by the Council for International and Public Affairs. They're a nonprofit, issue-oriented publishing house. And they embraced it for its subject matter, for which we're very grateful. But the regular old publishing houses,
And I noticed in the frontispiece you say that all the proceeds of the book will go to anti-nuclear.
all of our proceeds, all the proceeds of the authors. We can't donate the proceeds of the publishers, but they're nonprofit too, so nobody's making any money off of this. But hopefully the nuclear watchdog groups and the environmental groups and the social justice groups will. So if people go, if people go,
So
that's the idea.
That's a way for them to support their work.
Absolutely. So if people go on the website, which is ambushedgrandjury.com, and they buy the book there, all of the authors' profits go to whatever nonprofit group they designate. There's a way for them to designate it right on the website.
Now, how do you fit that in with the rest of your life?
I'm just beginning to have one now. I haven't even thought what it's going to be because it's been for so many years centered on this. I've traveled with the documents because I move around a bit and I can't leave them because I might need them, and I'm writing wherever I can write, and so it's been all-consuming, and I don't know what I'm going to do next, but it will not include writing a book.
I was just wondering because I would imagine that with this kind of project you couldn't do a lot of other legal work to support yourself.
This is a consuming project. But hopefully worth it. I think we're starting to have a little bit of an impact. And, people have been working to stop recreation at Rocky Flats. Many, many, many groups and people here in the Denver area. We're hoping that this will help them get some media attention and get some money and move forward with their work because they've been doing it for years.
Do you have any hopes or expectations that this will have an impact in terms of the production of nuclear weapons?
I hope so, because that's the main lesson of Rocky Flats. That from what we've learned in researching this and what other people have learned, you can't build nuclear weapons without contaminating the workers who do the work and the neighborhoods around the weapons plant, no matter where it is. And then you got to deal with the nuclear waste, and there's no place to put the nuclear waste. And then you got to think for just a second, do we really need any more? There are already so many. And why would we knowingly and intentionally contaminate our own citizens to make weapons to hurt other people when we already have, if we really want to hurt people, we've got the weapons. So it makes no sense to me. It's so obviously driven by dollars, both the ones that go into campaign coffers and the ones that go into defense contractors' profits, into their pockets, that it's not a real military decision. It's purely a fiscal one. And I hope if people can get the message of how dirty Rocky Flats really is and how incessantly the government has lied about everything nuclear, starting back in the 50s and running right up to the present. The sweetheart contracts, the incentive deals to defense contractors, even the cleanup at Rocky Flats right now is based around making money for the cleanup contractor, not about doing the best job at Rocky Flats. I mean, the government admits that it's leaving plutonium in the soil. and admits that it's doing so to save money, and the money that it's saving is going to the cleanup defense contractor. So it's so insulting. If I lived in the Denver area, I would be so insulted that they just keep doing it to you guys. So that's, we hope this will help.
Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about?
No, no, this is all I can talk about. I just can't wait to move on to something else too, but we've got to go to Washington and talk about it some more, and hopefully we will be meeting with some congressional representatives, the Colorado delegation. And
I did want to ask you
yeah.
about that. There's the possibility of a congressional investigation, is that right?
Well, we're meeting with some congressional representatives. There's always a possibility of one, but we haven't heard anybody being willing to do it yet. We hope to convince them that they should.
Are you, do you have any thoughts about, would it have to be someone from Colorado?
No, but it should be. And I hope it's Mark Udall. I really do, because I think he's the one to do it. So we'll see.
Let me ask you also, I know that in the book you discussed the issue of Wes McKinley taking a personal risk, and you know, and also the other two people, Jackie Brever and John Litsky. What about yourself? Has it felt like a risk to you to be so involved in this work and to write the book?
No, it hasn't. I don't feel at risk at all, other than maybe being overly fatigued from doing it. But no, I don't. John Lipsky, yes, he's at risk. Wes, he's at risk. Jackie, she's been at risk for so long. Yeah, but not. I'm their chronicler. I'm somebody that helped them put the pieces together and hopefully stay out of the legal morass in the interim. But I personally don't feel at risk.
Have you, other than what you've already said, has there been anything about this whole process that's been surprising or astonishing to you?
The depth of the deception. It's been depressing. I mean, I've seen it elsewhere around the weapons complex. I've seen it at Los Alamos, but I got to tell you, the Denver area has really been betrayed. Colorado as a state, Denver area in particular, you have really been betrayed with lies and secrecy and an incredible amount of contamination that people, instead of saying, boy, you know, we made some mistakes, and some of it we didn't know about and some of it we did, and how can we help you now? Can we get some medical monitoring for the people that used to live in the area? Can we get some medical monitoring for you workers that used to work there? Can we clean it up real good so that your grandchildren don't get contaminated by it? Instead of doing that, there's more lies and more deception and a real PR effort to make it look like it's just a clean old place anyway, because after all, there's going to be kids playing there. So what was surprising to me was, boy, how far they'd go. You know, that it's still happening. You'd think somebody would take pity on this area after a while and just say, come on, these guys have had enough. But no.
I should stop.
Okay.
And you get some rest.
Yeah, well, not rest, but I do have to go do some other stuff. You want me to go see if Wes is here?
That would be great.
Sure.
Do you think it would, I probably can't come up, maybe I should just...
Yeah, I don't think you should leave your stuff here. You don't happen to have your cell phone with you, do you?
I don't.
And I don't have mine, and well, let's see. Oh no, I know he's not back, because it's only 1 o'clock. I know he's not back. I beg your pardon. He won't be back till about 2:30 or 3.
Actually, I think I will stop this now, since it's still going.
Yeah, good.
So.
I thought you had. I'm going to run. Do you need any help getting any stuff? Okay. Thank you so much for doing